Dan's been a great supporter since day one of what we've been doing at NextCubed, and so I really want to thank you for that partnership. So what I'm going to talk about today is what we see, at least at NextCubed and at Sway Ventures, as the future of healthcare, and that really is digital healthcare, or more generally, literally the digitization of healthcare across every part of the healthcare system. And within this talk, because I know not everyone in the room is probably intimately familiar with this revolution that's going on, I want to describe some of the opportunities, some of the disruptors, the financial markets related to early stage investing, and the commercialization of these technologies to familiarize many of you in the room with this sort of next wave of healthcare. Pass through that. So, to give you a little bit of background, what Dan was alluding to, we left 2019 at NextCubed making 16 investments and deploying over $3 million in capital across those 16 investments. We don't have the final numbers out yet, but based on 2018 numbers, we believe that we may have been the most active digital health investor in the nation across any other institutional investor. Of course, our numbers as an early stage investor are not as large as the Andreessens or the Khoslas of the world, but in terms of activity, we have a broad understanding of what's going on at the earliest stages. Nick, who's our program manager back there, has developed a pipeline of 1,600 or maybe 1,800 companies, pre-A companies in the space. And so we're monitoring literally every company and what they're doing on a monthly basis. So a little bit about us in a little bit more detail. These are some of the statistics. We now have 23 total healthcare investments, in addition to the 16 that came in 2019. We have, those 23 companies have raised over $30 million of venture capital. We also have 18 subject matter expert advisors. These are folks like the former number 2 at the FDA, the former VP of digital health at Stanford, physicians who have been the chief medical officer at large hospital systems. And those folks work with us and we implant them into our startups after we make an investment. We also have a number of mentors that are part of our program from the leading healthcare companies in the world. And we're also starting to launch companies ourselves with very talented technical co-founders, visionary CEOs. In addition, we built an investor network to support our teams of now almost 40, or actually I think a little over 40 institutional digital health investors. And we've created a community there of those investors, not only to share deal flow from what we're investing in at the earliest stages, but also down the road to allow people to syndicate deals across of our platform. So, as Dan was mentioning, recently this last year in an unsolicited article from a national innovation-based news website, we were named one of the top 10 digital healthcare accelerators in the world. Now, this was really exciting for us as this program really formally didn't start until January of last year. So to go from inception to being named one of the top 10 was really validating for us and what Nick and I are building at NextCubed and what the entire firm is building. So, as Dan was also mentioning, also like to highlight some of the folks in Southern California that we've been supporting specifically. Now, our program is a national program. We invest in companies from San Diego to Maine. But to sort of bring it home for the folks that are in the room, Trials AI, which Dan mentioned, is a clinical trials company that uses artificial intelligence and natural language processing to design clinical trial protocols for sponsors. They recently closed a major top 20 pharmaceutical client. And as a result of that, they've had a lot of success on the fundraising trail recently. Teal Ventures, which is a San Diego-based digital healthcare firm, just invested within the last few months. And prior to that, Amplify out of LA, another institutional investor, invested in their most recent round. Also, as Dan mentioned, MedCrypt, which is a cybersecurity provider for IoT medical devices. As many of you guys in the room probably are aware, starting on January 1st of this year, the FDA is now requiring that all medical devices that are connected to the cloud must have cybersecurity provisions that, lo and behold, line up almost exactly with what MedCrypt has developed. And because of that, Sway Ventures, NextCube, Long River Ventures, and more recently, ENIAC Ventures, also a San Francisco-based firm, and Section 32 have invested to support that company. So some of the highlights that we've had. In addition, we've also started launching companies. So we launched a company called Repurpose AI, which uses artificial intelligence to discover new drugs, potentially reducing time to market by 10 plus years and the cost to market by over $1 billion. Right, so these are the type of things that we're supporting. These are the type of things we're looking at. This is the way that we're perceiving the future of healthcare. So I want to speak to you guys a little bit more about the opportunity as related to digital healthcare. Specifically, this, right? This is the starting point. So you see this and some people laugh or they smile about this, but this is the reality. Probably not for the folks that are here in this room, but I grew up in a place in Kentucky where this is a reality for many folks. Bankruptcy, right? The leading cause of bankruptcy in this country, right, is our industry. And we have to do something about it. And the old ways of doing it obviously don't work, and we have to figure out a new way. And I'll suggest or put forward today that digital health and software is one of the pathways so we can change this picture. To give it a little bit more gravitas, I refer you guys to this picture here. And it says in a recent survey that 9 out of 10 parents, and particularly mothers, right, are foregoing medical services, needed medical services for themselves so that their children can be provided healthcare services, right? Absolutely nuts. And then this one, right? We call ourselves the most developed, wealthiest country in the history of the world, but look at these spikes in US maternal death rates, right? Since the late 1980s. This is preposterous, right? And you can't just justify this away or say this has something to do with socioeconomics. Obviously, the differences for African American mothers are staggering, but look in terms of percentage, for white mothers as well, the percentage increase in death rates is the same percentage over that time, right? This is the best that we can do with the most advanced, wealthiest country in the world, where we spend $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare. And these stats probably won't surprise many of you guys in the room here as well, right? The global healthcare spend is going to nearly $9 trillion this year. And the percentage of percentage of the population 65 and older is going to double by 2050. And as many of you are well aware, 10,000 people a day in our country alone turn 65, meaning their healthcare becomes essentially a ward of the state, right? And how are we going to pay that in an era where essentially those costs need to remain flat over the next 20 years so that we can provide benefits to anyone? And so again, I would suggest that the old ways of doing it are not going to work. And furthermore, to double down on this point, you see the increases here in percentage of GDP on health spend. We're approaching 20% of every dollar that our government spends is being put towards healthcare. And there's no end in sight. This line is not flattening out, right? If you put a trend line through this. So where are we spending all of this money, this $3.5 trillion a year that we put into healthcare? Well, approximately 50% is spent on 3 areas: hospital services, physician services, and pharmaceuticals, right? So you can't solve any of the problems in healthcare unless you're solving for those 3 areas. Now, what I'll tell you today, the areas with regard to hospital services and physician services, they make up about 40 cents on the dollar. On the other side, pharma, which gets far more news coverage, makes up only 12 cents on the dollar. Now, pharma is a less fractured industry, and we can speak about that in terms of what the needs are to reduce cost. While hospital and physician services essentially have 100 separate sub-industries within those industries. But the bottom line is that if we don't tackle those three areas, there's nothing that we can do to change the future of healthcare. And those trend lines will continue on the same trajectory, and we will bankrupt each other, and we will bankrupt our country. So with digital health, though, for the first time since the advent of clean water and vaccines, we have the opportunity to reduce cost, improve outcomes, and change the social determinants of health. So I bring that up because, as many of you guys here in the room are also well aware, of course, all the companies that we work for and have worked for over the years, they say that when they're going to the FDA for approval, or they're going to Health and Human Services to get a new code, right, for your device, and say, yeah. Well, what we're doing, of course, it's going to improve outcomes, and it's going to reduce costs, and we have fancy pharmacoeconomic modeling or device economic modeling that we do. But of course, none of that is ever true, right? There's never been a major initiative in healthcare in this country, right, since the middle of the last century that has both reduced cost and improved outcomes at the same time, right? It just doesn't happen. The only things that have actually done that have been public health around clean drinking water and other similar issues, things like surgical masks in hospital settings, hand washing, and vaccines, right? Those have been the only health innovations that have actually done that. And they surely didn't really hit on the social determinants of health. So with digital healthcare, we can hit all of these at the same time because of data, right? Data is the way that we're going to unlock and change the future of healthcare in this country. And I'll point you guys to this graphic here. And what I want you to focus on is the upper left corner there. This is the way 80, 90% of healthcare operates right now, right? You have a payer, you have a provider, and you have a patient. And they work in a loop around and around and around and around. What digital healthcare is it's the bottom right corner, right? And it's the bottom right corner that changes everything about healthcare. It's the convergence of connected medical devices, right? Pharmaceuticals designed by computers rather than decades in the laboratory. It's analytics, it's communication systems. And what's really important that I want you guys to see here as well is the feedback loop is different here, because instead of it just being a loop back and forth between those entities, now when you have data, the patient truly sits in the middle rather than in a corner of healthcare. And payers can be integrated into the process without them simply saying no for the sake of saying no, because they can make reasonable data-driven decisions. Providers, right? They can do things, or they can do things at a pace that they've never been able to do before. So if we're going to have this future of healthcare, what does that look like, right? What is the future of healthcare when we're talking about digital health and data? This is a graphic recently published by CB Insights, which publishes some great data on the industry. And what you can see here are an example of about 100 companies reinventing the practice of medicine. And as they lay out here, this is a literal virtual hospital that can now be established in healthcare due to technology, due to AI, due to machine learning, due to IoT devices. Now, you don't need to look at anything in particular here, but what's really important, the take home here for the hospital setting, which includes hospital services and physician services, is that the key to changing healthcare in that sector is that currently too few patients, right? Too few patients receive, or too many patients receive too little health care, and a very small fraction of patients receive too much health care, right? And so how do you solve that issue? You solve that issue through patient stratification, and you solve that issue through the remote delivery of care, right? Taking 80, 90% of the things that happen inside the four walls of a hospital or a clinic and moving them out so that they occur in the home, and so that the analysis occurs in the cloud, so that physicians are only brought in when somebody is trending the wrong way. They only come in and see my wife in the ER when they're truly sick and having an emergency. And therefore, you can cut out, tens of percentages on every dollar that's spent in healthcare. Because, as I go home every night and my wife is there and she tells me about what she sees in the ER, right? And, she sees gunshots, of course, and she sees cardiac arrest and she sees stroke and all those things. That's what the hospital was built for, right? The hospital was not built to treat, or is not necessary to even treat things, honestly, like the common cold or even up to the flu, right? And so the future is a system where if you have a question, you can have an intelligent bot that feeds you back information. And then if you need to talk to somebody, you can talk to somebody using a telehealth platform. And then if you need to talk to somebody and you need to see somebody, then you go to urgent care. And then if you have a true emergency, you end up in the ER, right? Patient stratification and the remote delivery of care changes everything in the hospital system. Then we also have platform technologies, right? Like I was mentioning before, artificial intelligence. And so artificial intelligence lays over this area, but also the pharmaceutical sector as well. Some of the companies like Repurpose AI that we're invested in, of course, fall into this space. And so now it's the advent of IoT, moving things outside, plus AI in the cloud that can truly enable this transformation. And then, of course, the reason why we're invested in MedCrypt is for the reason, what you see here. Of course, as you're moving things into the cloud and as data becomes important, cybersecurity, patient privacy even become a more important issue. So you must secure the data as well. So it's just not the little tiny startups, though, that are banging at the walls of traditional healthcare, right? The tech giants are coming as well. Here's some headlines recently from the news, right? Google announced plans to use AI to reinvent the $3 trillion a year US healthcare industry. And through their investments in Verily and similar, they're putting their money where their mouth is. And then just recently, just a few days ago, Apple, Google, Amazon, and Microsoft announced that they're working on developing FHIR, which is pronounced FHIR, for medical records, essentially an interoperability platform that'll allow a whole wealth of innovation to occur on top of this interoperability platform. You'll also see Google talking about recently, they developed an AI tool that bested clinicians in breast cancer detection. And Amazon recently launched Amazon Care, a virtual medical clinic for employees, right? So you have the little annoyances for if you're working in strategic little startups that, you may bring them in, you may invest in them, try to maybe keep them at bay, all that's cute, that little thing that you're doing. But it's not just them, right? Tech is also coming to eat legacy healthcare's lunch, to put it simply. So what's backing all this, to give you guys an idea? And I realize not everybody in the room is every day involved in the financial markets around how these technologies are being built. And so what you'll see here in this graph is you see how liquid the VC markets are for these type of technologies. And these VC markets also indicate work from corporate venture capital as well. So some of these dollars are coming from the very companies, large companies that you guys are working with. And what you see here, you see the industry in 2011, there was only about $1 billion that went in total, which is a relatively small number into digital healthcare, period. But you see, as we got into 2018, 2019, 2 record years, $8 billion followed up by a $7.5 billion year, with average round sizes around $20 million going into VC-backed digital healthcare companies. What you'll also see is a very active market, and this is really impressive. This is the number of repeat and new investors coming into the market, into this space. And I'll again say a large percentage of this are actually corporate strategics, healthcare systems, device manufacturers, pharma that are also investing in the youth space. And you can see this trend to more and more investors coming in. And it's not just they're coming in to chase trends of great returns. They're coming in because the tidal wave is just starting, right? Everybody, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they realize this is the place to be. Institutional investors realize this is the place to be. Strategics realize this is the place to be. And here are some of the deals broken up by some of the subcategories. Here you'll also notice some of the largest deals in the area. You'll see things like Gympass on one side of 200 million, or PathAI, which is used to diagnose disease. You'll also see things like Tempus, $200 million rounds. And there's also been a number of healthcare unicorns recently that have been established in the venture community. So these are companies with $1 billion plus valuations, and these numbers are multiplying every single year. Now, on the other side, what's really interesting, so money's coming in, but what's going out in this sector? So what you'll see here is a comparison, 2013 to 2017, of some IPOs in the sector. And what I want to point out to you guys that's really important here is that on the left-hand side, you'll see some traditional pharma biotech IPOs, and on the right, you'll see the digital health. What's really important here is the digital health IPOs are rivaling pharma IPOs, right, that are coming into the space, but the dollars that are going in, because these are software investments, rather than investing in wet chemistry, the returns on invested dollars are orders of magnitude greater in this space. And so this is why also strategics, institutions, corporate venture capital are flooding into this space, because you're getting pharma-sized returns for software-sized investments. And here's some acquisitions that you guys might be familiar with, including a few that are relevant to Southern California, including Best Buy's acquisition of GreatCall, all right, for nearly $1 billion, and ResMed's acquisition of Propeller for about $225 million. And then this last year was a huge boon to the industry. There were 6 digital health IPOs, some of the companies that you can see up there. The combined market cap of these 6 IPOs today on January 1st was $17 billion, including a company, Livongo, that you guys might be familiar with, diabetes management sold to self-insured employers. They have a market cap of over $2.5 billion on their own. Now, here's what's really interesting, what I was leading to before, right? The excitement in this space and where things are going, is that if you look at the amount of capital that was invested into those 6 companies of probably $1.8 billion, the return at IPO, let alone the $4 billion that's been added, was $13 billion. So you got a 7x multiple that now is up to almost a 9x multiple if you held that stock, right? Further cementing that digital health, not just is it the way that things have to go, but financially for the industry, it's the way that things are going, right? And these numbers are sort of the proof in the pudding that shows that the returns are there and the technology is having a massive impact on where healthcare is going. So the next question I get, with setting the stage, okay, we know what you guys do, we know what the problem is, we see what the digital healthcare revolution, how it can change healthcare, and we see some of these market numbers, but I get a lot of questions about what I'm interested in. And so what I think is first most important when you're talking about early stage teams and configuration is to understand what an idealized team looks at, right? Or looks like. And I think it's important for you guys in the room to think about this maybe as you're evaluating companies that you might bring in as a customer or a vendor or an investment. And as we all know in this room, selling in healthcare is really hard. So you have to have an experienced healthcare operator and BD lead, right? One of the things that I see in healthcare early stage investing is so many folks don't understand the difference between a champion, right, and a check writer. And even sometimes there's a different person, there's a decision maker on top of these folks that are part of the process. And so having folks that understand the intricacies of the industry are always important to the success here. You also need a clinician or somebody that's been there in that decision maker role, that operator, that understands the person that's ultimately the user of the technology or the distributor, right? You must know the mind of your decision maker. You need a technologist, but what's interesting in digital healthcare is that I argue that the technologist, raw talent, is more important than healthcare experience if you're surrounding them with somebody who's a clinician or a known decision maker in that role and a known healthcare operator or BD lead. And finally, you need policy and regulatory expertise, because as everyone knows in this room, you can't do anything in healthcare without understanding the regulatory and policy environment that your product exists within. And so those who do not know are doomed to fail, right? And so this is where the folks in this room have a strategic advantage versus a lot of folks coming from the technology side, where they come in without a full understanding and appreciation of policy and regulatory. And this is where things gets really interesting, right? When you have a team with this type of depth and technological, regulatory, BD, and clinical expertise. So when it comes to product, we always look for three things. We look for products that understand who the payer is, what physicians need in a product to make it useful to them, to make their lives easier rather than harder, and then one that focuses on the patient and the outcomes. And you wouldn't believe all the companies that we see that only work on two of the three Ps. And I'll guarantee you, whether you're developing a new product inside of a major strategic or you're developing a new product in a startup, if you only solve for two of the three Ps, your company will fail, right? And this gets back to who's on your team. So you've got to solve for all these three stakeholders all the time. And I'll argue as well for any physicians or clinicians in the room that the physicians are oftentimes the ones that get left out in this. We oftentimes, as technologists, as scientists, design solutions, right? We design solutions for the patient and the payer, but not the physician. And one of my secret weapons as an investor is I'll go home and I'll re-pitch ideas to my wife. And if the answer isn't, when I ask her, would you use this or would you work this into your clinical workflow? If the answer isn't F no, right? Then I think we're on to something. But I'll tell you 80, 90%, she says, only if required by, what they call a suit in the hospital, which is a non-medical executive, right? Or if only required by federal regulation, will they incorporate these things into their clinical workflow? Because most of the things make their lives harder, make their lives more difficult, right? See the EHR, right? Talk to any physician about their EHR they work with. There's even parody accounts now, right? There's Epic Twitter parody accounts. I don't know if any of you guys are aware of this. It's a great read if you want to understand what clinicians are dealing with every day with the technologies that startups or even strategic companies are developing. And getting back to the idea of selling in healthcare is hard. And this is no different, right? So these are the things that are not different in the future of digital healthcare, right? You develop something that works, it saves lives and it saves money, but it is not mapped to a customer's P&L. This is something that we think about every day, and if you're executive in a strategic, I encourage you to think about every day, right? And so the example is of a private payer needs to be able to monetize ROI from digital health investments, or really any investments, in less than 9 months, even though their greatest cost is chronic care disease management, right? But if it doesn't map in that short period of time, no matter how great it is, no matter the long-term ROI that you create, it's a non-viable product for your customer. And the reason is, as many of you guys are well aware, that patients switch payers so frequently that Kaiser's not going to pay for outcomes realized by Anthem or vice versa, right? And so these are the things as an investor that we're thinking about every day. And I encourage you guys in your companies, whether you're investing in digital healthcare solutions or you're thinking about internal initiatives, that you're driving towards this, because we see day in and day out as an investor, if you're not focusing on your customer's P&L and mapping to there and then mapping backwards to your product, your product is ultimately doomed to fail. So, getting back to sort of the thesis here, right? The three main cost drivers in healthcare are physician services, hospital charges, and pharma. So what am I specifically interested in? So I'm specifically interested in anything that hits the drug development life cycle, including digital therapeutics. I'm bullish on this area. Digital therapeutics and pharma, although a smaller area, only about 12 cents on every dollar, because it's a less fractured industry, you're looking at drug discovery, clinical trials, real world evidence, digital therapeutics. And when you solve for those things, you're solving for potentially $900 billion worth of pharma failures every single year, right? So the impact is massive. The sector is less fractured. I'm also interested, what I was mentioning to you before, anything that stratifies patient care and moves the point of care from a hospital or a clinic into the home. This is the future of healthcare, right? This is what we should be designing technologies for, whether you're a startup founder or you're working in a major strategic. I'm also really bullish on the infrastructure plays, right? The companies that you don't know what they do, but they fundamentally run healthcare behind the scenes. And so companies like this are being developed, sort of platform technologies that say run CCM and RPM systems and are the aggregators of data behind the scene. I also am very bullish on cybersecurity. Obviously, with our investment in MedCrypt, as I was mentioning earlier and Dan was alluding to, we're very interested. Anytime you're ratcheting up the use of data, you have to secure it. Where I'll tell you I'm a little bit more selective is in clinical decision support. So as a patient, being the spouse of a physician, clinical decision support is going to be something that's going to be impacting all of our personal care directly within the next 10 years. The problem is if you're sitting in a strategic and you're looking to build a business around this, is that there's a fear that ultimately this could end up as a commodity business. So where there's hundreds of AI algorithms that can read breast cancer scans or can read orthopedic scans. And so ultimately, while these become immensely useful for healthcare writ large, it becomes a race to the bottom due to the commoditization of this technology. Now, there are some companies, I should say, that have unique platforms and unique business models that changes the dynamics here. But I would caution you as executives to think long and hard about whether this is something that is going to be revolutionary today, maybe, but will it still be revolutionary in 5 years or 10 years? We will ultimately be seeing the ROI for that long-term investment. I'm also very interested in interoperability, but again, selectively, right? The problem with interoperability, even the FHIR standard that Amazon and Google and Microsoft and Amazon we're talking about, is that everyone wants interoperability in data and healthcare data, but very, very few people have established a business model for it. It's something that everybody wants, something that everybody needs, but when they say who's gonna pay for it, everyone points the finger. And there haven't been real established business models that have learned how to operationalize and monetize interoperability. So the world is still looking for the killer business model for interoperability. And in D2C, we're curious, right? So we've made some investments in the D2C space, including a company called Bloom, which is bringing clinical grade urine analysis to the home. It's a company that's doing very well on the fundraising trail, just like MedCrypt, just like Trials. And so we're excited about some companies, but that area is very finicky. So I encourage you that when you're evaluating D2C, it's not as simple as does it work? It's not as simple as does it make money? But you have to get consumers to buy it, right? And people have shown with Fitbits and supplements that they will buy these things, but they've also shown that they have very little attachment, right? How many people have Fitbits that are actually they bought for a loved one that are still sitting in the plastic in a nightstand drawer, right? And so this is the reality of the D2C market that you have to think long and hard about before jumping in with 2 feet into this space.